Hey everyone, this is Mike James with the Church of God International. We're going to try something a little bit different today. We're going to do a sermon and we're going to record it using the GoToMeeting application. So I'm going to do the sermon on what is called the pale horse. And this sermon deals with Revelation chapter 6, verses 7 and 8. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go to my slides, and we want to use this new technique to see what you all think of it out there. So I'm going to begin my sermon now and give us some feedback on how you feel about it. Now, when we talk about the pale horse, we're of course discussing Revelation chapter 6, verses 7 and 8. So you're probably all familiar with that scripture. You read about the pale horse, and the rider on this pale horse is death, and Hades is following close behind him. So we see a picture of that on the screen. It looks pretty foreboding. But the scripture that deals with this is on our screen right now, Revelation chapter 6, verses 7 and 8. And it says, when the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, come. I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. So we're going to focus closely on this particular scripture, and especially verse 8, and get real nuanced and detailed about what that particular scripture may mean. Now, if we go back in chapter 6 of Revelation, we will read about these other horsemen. So we read about the white horse in verse 2, and then we read about the second seal in verse 3, and it mentions the red horse in verse 4, and then the third seal in verse 5, and we read about this other rider, and that third rider has to do with famine. And that what we see in verse 8 is that each of these riders is kind of encompassed in that final pale horse. So we want to understand why that may be. I believe there's a reason that God had John write things down in that particular way. And in order to understand that, we want to go back in scripture to Luke chapter 21 and begin to understand this. Now notice what it says in Luke 21, beginning in verse 8. And he said, take heed that you be not deceived, for many will come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and the time draweth near. Go ye not therefore after them. But when you shall hear of wars and commotions, be not terrified, for these things must first come to pass, but the end is not by and by. Then said he unto them, nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and great earthquakes shall be in diverse places, and famine and pestilence, and fearful signs and great signs shall there be from heaven. Now, if you look at the order of things here, we can connect this back with Revelation verses 6, 7, and 8. And let me just go back and take a look at that. You'll notice that what came first with these horsemen of the apocalypse, these four horsemen, was this individual riding a white horse. And what we believe that that individual represents is over here in Luke. It represents the rider that is mentioned right here in verse 8, saying, I am Christ, and the time draweth near. That is what is represented in Revelation chapter 6, verse 7 by that first horseman. As we look at verse 9 of Luke 21, we see the mention of the wars and commotions. That was the second rider in Revelation chapter 6, the red horse. The black horse in Revelation, the third horse, is encompassed by verse 11 of Luke 21, where it mentions the famines. And finally, the fourth horse in Revelation 6, 7, and 8, we believe refers to the pestilences that we read about here in Luke 21 and verse 11. So hopefully you can see why we make those connections here, because Jesus is talking about what is going to happen at the end time. And of course, Revelation speaks about that in Revelation chapter 6. Now, moving on, I want to connect all of this to the great pandemic of 1918 to 1920. And in this particular pandemic, 50 million, maybe 100 million people died. Now, there are a lot of people worried today about this COVID-19 pandemic. But what we need to recognize is that thus far, as I speak to you, there are only about 90-some thousand Americans who've died thus far from COVID-19. Now, what occurred with the 1918 to 1920 flu pandemic is 675,000 Americans died in this 2-year period, and about half of those people died during the fall of 1918. So as we can see, this is a very different pandemic that is occurring today in comparison to the pandemic of 1918 to 1920. But one thing we'll learn about the pandemic of 1918 to 1920 is how it relates to what Revelation 6 verses 7 and 8 tell us about what is going to happen at the time of the end before Christ's second coming. The wars, the famines, the pestilences, the wild animals, and how they all come together relates very succinctly to the 1918 to 1920 pandemic. And I'm going to explain that in today's sermon. Now, when we look back at 1918 to 1920, here's another photo from that time frame. What is also different about this time frame is young and old alike were dying. During the pandemic today, the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020, most of the people that have died are older folks who have certain pre-existing medical conditions. That was not the case during the 1918 to 1920 pandemic. All kinds of people were dying during this pandemic of 1918 to 1920, and we can see that by these military folks who are in a hospital here in this particular photo. Now, in comparison to other pandemics of the past, the 2020 pandemic in the world today just doesn't compare for the amount of people that lost their lives. If we look back at the Great Plague of the 1300s, what we find out is 75 to possibly 200 million people died during that particular pandemic. So the loss of life was just much greater at this particular time than the pandemic that we're going through today. Now, when we talk about the pandemic of 1918 to 1920, people died in two particular ways. If you think of the flu and what it does to you, again, it infects your lungs. There's an infection that inflames the air sacs in the lungs, and this leads to what is called pneumonia. And for many of the people that died in 1918 to 1920, this is what was a problem with them. They died due to pneumonia. Now, others died due to the fact that their body's defenses were being broken down by the influenza virus, and this allowed bacteria to more easily invade the lungs, which led to other issues in the body causing their death when that bacteria got inside of them due to their weakened system. Now, when we go back to Revelation 6, verses 7 and 8, and we look at the mentioning of dying by the sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth, I really want to hone in on that in regards to the 1918 to 1920 pandemic, because I believe it's a microcosm of what's going to happen right before the second coming of Christ. And I'm going to explain why by beginning with what we call the people who died by the sword. Now, how did the sword lead to death during the 1918 to 1920 pandemic? One big reason was it was at the end of World War I. So many people were moving to and fro on the earth due to World War I. People were moving about on the earth in so many different ways that had not happened in the past due to the Great War, World War I. So the fact that you had all these movements of troops all over the world, that had a lot to do with why the pandemic spread in such a great degree. Now, when we think about today and in the future, right before the second coming of Christ, travel is so frequent today and so ubiquitous that we can see how germs can move from one area of the world to another. So that makes a lot of sense. We're beyond the point where germs will not be able to move very far or very fast. We've gone too far down that particular road. But another reason the sword plays such a significant role is that during this particular pandemic, we had many of the first troops who were infected were on a cantonment. It was called Camp Funston in Kansas, and they became sick, we believe, due to a flu virus that may have begun in Haskell, Kansas, Haskell County, Kansas, where there were a lot of farms, especially pig farms. And experts today believe that this particular pandemic began on a pig farm in Haskell, Kansas. Now, there are other theories about this. Some believe it began in China, others believe it began in Europe. But in the research I've conducted, the best theory, in my estimation, is that this pandemic began on a pig farm in Haskell County, Kansas. And in that particular county, a doctor noticed a virulent form of the flu that was spreading in Haskell County, and he wrote this into his logbook and made a note of it. And this was in the spring, early on in 1918. Now, there were troops from Camp Funston who came back to Haskell, Kansas, and then went back to their cantonment at Camp Funston, and then they took that flu not only from there, but to other cantonments of U.S. troops throughout the country, and then those troops moved that flu epidemic onto Europe, is the belief, and then to the rest of the world. So again, the fact that there's a war or a world war plays a big role in a pandemic moving in the way it did in the 1918 to the 1920 time frame. Now, when we begin to move out from this particular location, what we notice is that here you can see the trail of the flu going from a farm possibly in Kansas over to Camp Funston. And from there, it then began to move on to other locations. Specifically, it moved on to ships, transport ships like the one pictured here, which is called the Leviathan. And the Leviathan was a huge transport ship that was going from New York over to Europe, transporting US soldiers. And in John Barry's book, The Great Influenza, he describes the scene on some of these transport ships where there was just blood in the hallways from the hemorrhaging that was occurring in these individuals who began to bleed out of their body due to the virulent strain of the virus that was in their body. Barry talks about the nurses and doctors on board were just overwhelmed by the amount of people who were becoming sick on these large transport ships. But even though Washington was made aware of what was happening, they continued to send these ships overseas due to their feeling that they needed to send the troops there to end World War I. Another recollection I have in reading Barry's book was of a soldier who was on another transport ship, the Wilhelmina, who was looking at another ship passing across the Atlantic Ocean called the Grant. And the soldier recollected that as he looked at the Grant, he noticed, as you can see in this particular photo, that bodies were being dropped into the sea of those who had died from the virulent strain of the flu that they were suffering on these transport ships. So it was a very macabre scene as these bodies were just being dropped into the sea, not being able to be buried at home with their friends and family around. So this epidemic was a terrible thing, and Barry's book really makes that clear with a number of scenes like the ones I just recollected for you. Now, as we move on, as the transport ships moved across the ocean, the soldiers took that flu to other soldiers in France and England, and then onto the battlefields in World War I. Again, this book I'm referring to is by John M. Barry, and again, it's titled The Great Influenza. Another book on this subject you may be interested in reading is The Pale Rider by Laura Spinney. Now, as we continue on, I want to talk a little bit more about this concept of the sword and how it plays its part in what will happen at the time of the end. Many of the people who die in war are not killed in battle. They are actually killed by disease or pestilence. If we look at some examples like the Civil War, for every 2 soldiers who were killed, I should say rather, for every 1 soldier who was killed in battle, 2 were killed by disease in the Civil War. In the Boer War in South Africa, for every 1 soldier killed in battle, 10 were killed by disease. And finally, the statistics for the Spanish-American War were for every 1 American killed in battle, 6 were killed by disease. So again, we see that when you move troops to parts of the world that they are not familiar with, it becomes much easier for disease to grab a hold of them. And when you have people living outside in trenches and things of that sort, again, it's much easier for disease to take over. Another reason disease occurs during wartime is an example that I will give you from the siege of Paris during the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. Due to the fact that Paris was under siege, the people were trapped in their homes and could not escape. And when disease hits in that type of circumstance, it can really lead to a terrible effect on the people who are under siege. In Paris, 40% of those who were living in the city were killed due to a measles outbreak. So it's not only soldiers who die in war due to disease, but it can also be the civilian population, as we see from this particular example in the Franco-Prussian War. Again, looking back at this scripture that I continue to refer to, we've just addressed the sword and how the sword will play a part in that final great pandemic that will hit the world right before the second coming of Jesus Christ. Due to the fact that war is going on, pandemics can much more easily hit the population. Now, let's take a look at this second point, famine. Let's talk about the famine that is mentioned in verse 7. And again, here are some really disheartening pictures of people suffering from famine, but I want to show you what famine is really like and how lucky we all are to have food here in places like the United States and Canada. You know, some of our Christian brothers and sisters in other parts of the world are not as fortunate as us to have food. This is what famine looks like, ladies and gentlemen. And again, it is not a good picture. Now, how does famine occur? Well, famine occurs due to drought or lack of rain, but famine also occurs due to pests. But a third way that famine occurs is due to war. When armies lay siege to different communities, sometimes those communities will flee and they will move to another part of their country where there is a lack of support to sustain this new population that has come to a different area. Now, this can also be exacerbated by drought or various pests. And a great example of this occurred during the World War I and the 1915 to 1918 time frame in what is modern day Lebanon today. At the time, Lebanon was not a country. What is understood to be Lebanon today was under the control of the Ottoman Empire. And there was a place in Lebanon called Mount Lebanon, and about 400,000 people lived in this area. And this area was being blockaded by the Allied powers during World War I, and it was also being blockaded by the Ottoman Empire and the Central Powers. So what is modern day Turkey today? What is the vestiges of the Ottoman Empire? They were blockading Syria, which leads right into Lebanon. And they were blockading it because they wanted their soldiers to be supplied and fed. And the Allied powers were blockading Lebanon from the sea to the west in the Mediterranean Sea. So this was a terrible and unfortunate occurrence for the people living in Lebanon. 200,000 out of a population of 400,000 perished due to this war that was going on, and also a pestilence, or I should say a famine that occurred, which was exacerbated not only by the blockade of the warring powers, but also by locust infestation that occurred during that 1915 to 1918 time frame. Now, going back to Luke chapter 21 and verse 11, the final item there that is mentioned is pestilences. And I want to focus in on pestilences right now. You know, how does a wartime situation lead to pestilence? Well, we've talked a little bit about that already, but if we go back to Revelation 6 and verse 8, and we notice what the red wording says there, it talks about the pale horse bringing death, not only by pestilence, which Luke tells us about, but it also mentions with the wild beasts of the earth. And that's what I want to focus in on for the remainder of this sermon. How do wild beasts of the earth relate to death during a pestilence? That's what I want to look at right now. Now, when we think about the 1918 to 1920 pandemic, the way people died, or one of the way people died during this pestilence, was through cyanosis. And if you look at this particular picture, you'll notice the individual with the lighter shading on their face and then the darker shading. This is an indication that this person is suffering for cyanosis. And cyanosis occurs due to the fact that there's not enough oxygen in the blood, and the body begins to take on this darker shade. In some cases, individuals will take on almost a mahogany appearance due to the fact that the lungs are so damaged that oxygen is not getting through the blood to oxygenate the body and give it the consistent look that it would have if the body had oxygen. Due to the lack of oxygen, this dark blue or black appearance took over during the 1918 to 1920 pandemic. About 60% of the world got this flu bug. And again, in some parts of the world, 5, 6, 7, up to 8% of the population may have died from this particular flu pandemic. Another terrible result of this flu was subcutaneous emphysema, where pockets of air would come up into the skin due to the fact that the air was leaking out of the lungs. And when these patients were rolled on their side, they would make a sound similar to someone eating a bowl of Rice Krispies due to the pockets of air that were occurring. So I give you these examples to make it clear to you how diabolical pestilence is, which is this fourth rider on the pale horse that we read about. Now, understanding how terrible pestilence is and what it's going to do on this earth before Christ's second coming, I want to now connect the wild beasts of the earth and how they relate to pestilence. What is it about the connection between wild beasts? How did John know to write this down in connection with pestilence? When we think about this, what we need to remember as we look back at the famine at Mount Lebanon, and I just wanted to reiterate the mentioning of pestilence in Luke chapter 21, we see here that the wild beasts, some biblical commentators believe that because man will be infringing into the environments of animal due to famine at the end time, that might be a reason why wild beasts are mentioned in Revelation 6 and verse 8. Now that is definitely a possibility. Man is more and more moving into jungle areas, into forested areas, as we try to farm, as we try to feed our domesticated animals. And that could lead to more wild animals attacking man. But I believe there's another reason for this. And there's a biblical scholar named Alan Kirshner who's looked at this language in Revelation 6, verses 7 and 8. And Kirshner's written a book about it, Antichrist Before the Day of the Lord. Here's a picture of Mr. Alan Kirshner. And again, he's got a PhD, so he's a pretty smart guy. And what he says about sword, famine, and pestilence, if we understand it in the Greek, if we look at Revelation, which was written in the Greek, what sword, famine, and pestilence is, it's in the dative of means form in Greek. And all that means is that the salmon, famine, and pestilence are an instrument of some sort. And they relate to, if you understand Greek grammatical construction, they relate to the beasts. In other words, the beasts have an effect on the sword, famine, and pestilence as the ultimate agent or the intermediate agent. And what does that mean? In other words, it means this, that the wild beasts are the agents for the sword, famine, and pestilence. Now, how could that be that the beasts are the agents that are causing the sword, famine, and pestilence? Well, here's how that can be. If we think, and here's what Kirshner thinks, first of all. Kirshner believes that Satan is referred to as the dragon in Revelation 12, verse 9. But in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 9, we read about the coming of the lawless one will be in accordance with how Satan works. He will use all sorts of displays of power through signs and wonders that serve the lie. So Kirshner's looking at Satan as being the power behind the beast. And he's looking at Revelation 6, 7, and 8, the beast there being the satanic power behind the beast. And since Satan will influence the beast to cause the war at the end, which leads to the famine, which leads to the pestilence, that this is how the beasts act upon the sword, the famine, and the pestilence. He also refers to Revelation 13, where it talks about the dragon, who is Satan, standing on the shore of the sea, and he sees a beast coming out of the sea, which had 10 horns and 7 heads. Again, Satan is the being who's acting on the beast power, which leads to the great tribulation on the earth. So he sees that the beast in Revelation 6, 7, and 8 could be a reference to Satan and his influence on the beast power. Now, that's definitely a possibility, but there's a problem with that. Because when you look at Revelation 6, 7, and 8, the beasts are mentioned in the plural. So other commentators feel that there's more to it than just Satan. Satan definitely could be portrayed as one of the beasts, one of the wild beasts mentioned in Revelation 6, 7, and 8, for some of the reasons we just discussed. But also when you look at 1 Peter 5 and verse 8, what we read there is Satan is like a roaring lion. We already mentioned that Satan is like a dragon in Revelation 12 and verse 9. So Satan could be acting upon the beast power, which leads to the great world war at the end, right before the second coming of Christ. But what about famine?
how do beasts lead to famine? How are they the instrument that leads to famine? Well, obviously, when you think about it, we gave you the example of the famine at Mount Lebanon. Part of it had to do with the siege and the blockades laid by the warring armies, but also a locust swarm came upon Mount Lebanon during the First World War that also led to famine. And that could definitely happen during the time of the end, right before Christ comes. Pests, locusts, grasshoppers could cause great famine on this earth. Now, what about pestilence itself? How does pestilence caused by wild beasts? Well, when we look at Revelation 11 or Leviticus 11 and verse 7, we're reminded of the fact that we're not supposed to eat swine's flesh. And interestingly enough, when I did my research on the great pandemic of 1918 to 1920, the best theory about it is that it began on a hog farm in Haskell County, Kansas. Now, how does that relate to a pig? Well, most of our influenza that humans get can come from bird viruses. Birds carry a lot of influenza viruses, and birds can mix with other birds in various ways, as you can see on my slide here. Now, what's interesting about the swine is the swine is one of the best mammals for causing what is known as reassortment. Now, what is reassortment? Reassortment is when a virus moves from one species to another. And this is kind of how it happens. Let's say we have a pig on a pig farm, and there's either a wild bird that has infected a domesticated bird, and the domesticated bird might come into contact with a pig, or a wild bird could have a dropping on the ground, and the pig may walk on it, the pig may sniff it, the pig might touch this virus that comes out of a bird in some way. And these viruses are in birds' digestive tracts, which leads to the poop of a bird causing the virus to move to other species. So this can happen very easily. And again, reassortment occurs like this. What happens is these little spikes, as you can see on these little cells in my picture, they connect with sialic acid. So hemagglutinin could be on one of these pictures, and the hemagglutinin reassorts with the sialic acid cells in a pig, kind of like a hand in glove. And what occurs then is the bird virus mixes with what is inside the pig. Now, what can be in the pig are other viruses. Pigs can get viruses from humans. Pigs can get their own viruses. And this reassortment then occurs in the pig because of its sialic acid receptors on its cells. The sialic acid receptors on pig cells are much more adept at connecting with the receptors in the bird virus, leading to this mutation of the virus within the pig. This reassortment occurs, and then the pig can pass on that virus to humans that are interacting with the pig. So this is how viruses can move from one species to another. And isn't it interesting that this unclean animal, the pig, is one of the best animals for moving viruses from one species to another? When we think of our pandemic of 2020, what the experts are telling us is that it probably came from a bat virus. And again, the reassortment may have occurred through another animal. One good animal that might be the intermediary animal for COVID-19 is the pangolin, because of the study of the virus thus far is showing a similarity between COVID-19 and viruses that can exist in the pangolin that could be reassorted, originally coming from a bat. Again, bats are very good at carrying viruses, just like birds. But this particular virus is a little bit different than the influenza virus of 1918 to 1920. Now, something else we need to make mention of here is in Leviticus 11 and verse 8, it not only tells us we should not eat the meat of the unclean animals, it also tells us not to touch their carcasses. And a lot of these viruses that have occurred recently coming from bats have occurred, science is telling us, due to mixing with unclean animals. Now, as you look at these pictures from wet markets, you'll notice that they will often kill the live animals at the wet market and give you the animal right there. So as you can see from this picture, when you kill an animal, there's a lot of blood, there's a lot of seepage of fluids and bodily things from the animal gets into the air, and very easily could move viruses from one place to another, from animals to people in these particular wet markets, as we can see from the photos below. But again, God warns us against dealing with the carcasses of these unclean animals also, which wet markets are notorious for. So again, that connection between the bat and the pangolin was in the wet market in Wuhan, as were civet cats and other animals. As we look at this slide, you'll see another connection here between pandemics of the past and unclean meat or unclean animals. The plagues of the Middle Ages were caused by flea-infested rats. And we can read in Isaiah 66 and verse 17 that at the time of the end, God is going to be upset with people at that time of the end who are partaking in the meat of swine and also rats. Now, the plagues of the Middle Ages were caused by flea-infested rats. People weren't necessarily eating the rats, but rats were getting into the cities as cities were becoming a more common place where people were living. People were also traveling and trading more in the Middle Ages, and that led to rats moving from one area to another, getting on ships and things of that nature. When we look at HIV, which leads to AIDS, today AIDS is under control through therapeutic drugs, but it's still killed about 35 million people to date and is still killing people. We believe AIDS or HIV began in the 1920s due to the eating of chimpanzee meat or monkey meat in Africa. The SARS virus, which began in 2003, was believed to have been a bat virus that moved to a civet cat. And you can see that in one of my pictures here. And that is something that is eaten commonly in China. The MERS virus from 2012, again, we believe that was transmitted from a bat to a camel. Again, camel meat and camel milk is very common in Saudi Arabia, and that's where MERS began. And again, Ebola Ebola comes most likely from bat soup or some type of connection to a bat, is what the experts tell us. And again, Ebola reared its ugly head in 1976. We've had a reoccurrence of it in the 2000s, and it's a terrible disease. Now, again, all of these diseases are coming from unclean animals. Do we see a pattern here? Yes, we do. And let me just talk as we start to wind down about pandemics and the connection to wild animals. I want to tell you a little bit about the Nipah virus of 1998. As man was encroaching upon the jungles in Malaysia, what occurred there was pig farmers were encroaching into the jungles and clearing jungle. And in these jungles, bats were eating mangoes in mango trees, and the mangoes were falling to the ground. And obviously, pigs did what pigs do. They ate the mangoes that fell to the ground, and the mangoes were infected by the bat virus, leading to the pigs getting a virus, and then hundreds of people in Malaysia died due to this particular virus. Again, lead being caused by the encroachment on the jungle by mankind. So when we think about human encroachment in the future, what the experts are telling us is most animal species, especially mammal species, decrease when man begins to encroach in these wild areas. But there are 58 species or populations of mammals that increase when man begins to encroach into the wild. And guess what these two species are? Think about what we've talked about in this sermon thus far. One of the species is a bat. Bat populations actually increase when man begins to encroach in the wild. The second type of animal is the rat. And isn't it interesting that many of the pandemics of the past with bubonic plague were caused by rats with fleas, and many of our modern day, at least in the 2000 time frame, diseases are being caused by bat viruses. I find that very interesting and very telling. These unclean animals are causing disease that could be occurring in today and in the future. Now, again, what do I want to say in conclusion with this particular sermon? There is going to be a great pandemic at the end of this age before Christ's second coming, and it's going to be caused by sword, famine, and pestilence and the wild beasts of the earth. And one of the reasons the wild beasts are going to play into all of this is their connection to pestilence and pandemics. And when we look at places like China today and people who don't understand the truth of God, there are Christians in China, and some of them do believe the Bible, but many Chinese in our most populous nation in the world don't understand the Bible, don't understand the danger that is caused by eating unclean animals. I hearken to this scripture in Proverbs that I'm going to conclude with. Proverbs 4 and verse 19. The way of the wicked is as darkness. They know not at what they stumble. I hope this particular sermon has helped you understand a little bit more about the future pandemic that will occur at the close of this age. Let's not stumble in the darkness. Let's read our Bibles so we can remain in the light.